Hello and welcome to this session at Blockchain Week. Today we have Andrew Vranjes. He's the VP of Sales and GM of APAC for Blockdaemon, and he will be speaking with Konstantin Richter, the CEO of Blockdaemon, and they will be speaking about bridging TradFi to DeFi. Right, I'll pass it over to you, Andrew.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be back on my home turf in Australia. It's been a little while. It's been a really exciting conference. It's been great to meet everyone else from yesterday as well, and a pretty good party last night. So super excited to do this session with my CEO, Konstantin at Blockdaemon. And I just want to say thanks to the Australian Blockchain Association for organizing this. So let's get into it. Hey, Konstantin, how are you?
Good. Hi, Andrew. It's good to see you.
Yeah, great. Can we get a quick intro on you, quick background, and we'll just jump straight in after that?
Yeah, sure. I'm Konstantin Richter. I'm the CEO and founder of Blockdaemon. I'm from Germany. I was made over there back in the day. We were alluding to my absence of humor earlier when we were prepping for this call. So I'll try to not be too dry and not be too technical, and talk a little bit about what Blockdaemon aims to do and the wider sort of crypto DeFi landscape.
Yeah, and like in Australia, we like a good German beer. So maybe we can get something slotted in around beer or German food as well. We'll see how we go. But let's get into it. So Konstantin, you've been around the crypto space for such a long time. Can we get you to define your definition of DeFi from your perspective, and then maybe a bit of commentary on why it's such a hot topic so now as well?
Yeah, sure. When I got started in crypto, what I really actually initially cared about is the cryptography that allows you to ultimately offer anonymized transactions across a financial system that's not controlled by one single entity. And so the sort of separation between state and money was what originally got me excited. I think my perception has shifted a little bit, where I think I've become a lot less radical in the sense that I believe that to have true decentralized financial infrastructure, you need really legacy financial institutions to be connected to those rails, and you do need regulatory compliance. The world is unfortunately or fortunately very complex. And so, sort of absolute ownership of networks, like sometimes DeFi networks proclaim them as damaging as, a fully centralized network. And so, but to me, what it really means is ultimately financial services available to anyone, anywhere, without any single entity being able to block them from it. And so one of the things, and then also really what that means is that a software dictates the requirements and the rules. And those rules are, DAO is a good example. That can be an organization and people that, like in a democracy, decide what makes the most sense for the most people. And so that's what really attracted me. I think you can't talk about cryptocurrency and DeFi without talking about governance and government, actually. And so it's regulation and the sort of new form of open source projects. But DeFi is really banking services delivered by software, meaning I want a loan, I go to a marketplace where software gives me the rates based on a market, and I receive funding, and that's that. And ideally, my identity can be anonymous, even though it can be KYC'd. I can make sure that the funds I receive or the funds that I'm putting down as collateral are clean. We can track their history. And so it's really the perfect system actually to provide fraudless systems that are non-discriminatory, really. And so, but DeFi, is really that. And so think of your simple bank account. It's like you hold a cryptocurrency, you want to earn interest on it. You want to be able to borrow against it, and ideally, and invest. And so that's how I think about DeFi. And so DeFi is really just another term, really, for what crypto was, I think, all along. The D is important. The decentralized part is an important factor. And, we as Blockdaemon obviously play an important role and in that part, right? And we can talk a little more about that as well. But that's how I think about DeFi. Ultimately, you have a wallet, you have Bitcoin in it. I want to earn interest on it like I do on my checking account. Well, you used to. But it can be as simple as that.
Yeah, great. And talk to us a bit. You started to touch on it. Talk to us a bit about Blockdaemon, where you started, which was in the the blockchain infrastructure space, and the journey that you've taken us on now into DeFi as well. I think that's an important topic for the audience.
Yeah, sure. So the Genesis block, which is what we call the first block in a blockchain network, that records the history from get-go for Blockdaemon, really was me and some friends trying to run an ETH node back in the day in 2017, and really not being able to keep a node synced consistently to the network. A node is really the individual component of a decentralized ledger. It's a ledger it's a piece of software that dictates what transactions can go into a spreadsheet that's hosted on a server. The software that governs it is what we call a software client of a protocol. So for Bitcoin or Ethereum, they might look drastically different. And so in order to submit transactions to a blockchain network, you need access to a node that only you have access to, specifically if you're an institution, because these transactions get queued. And so you want to make sure you have priority, that not somebody else is clogging up that node. So if you're an exchange or a company that has a lot of customers, you want to have you should have a proprietary node you can hammer with transactions. And you want to make sure that that node operates and is perfectly synced to the network at any given point in time with latency, redundancy, and failover systems. And so that's really what the idea of Blockdaemon was. It's like, hey, we want to do this for people who have to service a lot of customers in a way that they don't have to worry about it. And so, that's still kind of what we do today. And so when I started, most folks were saying, hey, nobody's going to really want to run a node. Why would they do this? And why do they need to do it? And so back in the day, there were maybe a handful of cryptocurrencies, exchanges, and custodians were supporting. I remember Coinbase had 3 with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Litecoin. Now there's hundreds and hundreds. Each one of them are governed by, ultimately a node is governed by an individual open source community. And you need to be deep in Discords in order to understand when these clients get updated and what happens. And so in order to ensure that a node functions at any point in time, it's really a Herculean effort. And so we've been the first in the space to do this across a hybrid infrastructure. We've launched the Genesis block on a lot of these chains that have been launched over the last 4 to 5 years. And so we've built a reputation as really a core infrastructure provider. Nodes are sort of interesting because they're non-custodial. Just because we operate the nodes doesn't mean we get to touch any tokens or do anything with that originally. And so we started enabling exchanges and custodians with transaction-grade infrastructure. And we still do that. That means Bitcoin, Ethereum, all the large tokens, high availability infrastructure for anyone who wants to allow their users to send around tokens and wants ownership of their own network. And so we're decentralizing financial institutions individually, right? We want to give them the power to run their own infrastructure rather than have to rely on a third party and outsource the whole shebang that's crypto to a centralized provider. And so to that end, we're non-custodial, as mentioned. And so we're really a software and infrastructure company at heart. Over time, we've added functionality. And so at this point, we allow a financial institution to offer really all relevant financial services in the crypto sphere to their respective customer via one infrastructure integration. That means transaction-based revenue, that means yield earning, staking interest rates across staking nodes, as well as lending capabilities and liquid staking. And so, but again, we do that for institutions who can hold their own custody, who are large-scale entities who don't want to outsource the customer relationship ultimately. And we believe that most financial institutions have no interest in outsourcing their ultimately ownership of their customers to providers. And so we tread that line very carefully in making sure that we really are a technology enabler purely. And Blockdaemon has been able to do that well. And we operate now around the world. We've run more nodes than any individualized non-financial company in the world. I think over 35,000 full nodes at this point. I always say a metric that I can't back up, but just gives you an idea on like how to think about it, is that around 20% of global transactions in crypto at one point pass through a Blockdaemon node somewhere, right? And so our customers are exchanges, custodians that are crypto native, a good chunk of top 10 exchanges or custodians rely on components of our infrastructure. New financial institutions that are particularly focused in the digital realm, as well as offering cryptocurrencies to their customers, are among our customer base. And so at one point, we run a node for a wallet, an exchange, and on and off ramp, somebody, we're fairly ubiquitous in that space. And so, we want to bring DeFi to the masses through institutional channels in a manner that the overall network quality of these networks also increases, right? And so that's our contribution to decentralization. Decentralization requires individualized ownership, but it also only works if the network is really resilient. And so we're the network resilient part, right? So we bring that component to the table.
Yeah, if we had more time, I'd love to get into it. You and I are ex-telco, so the network bit. Yeah. I think people forget, that blockchain is a network, and a highly performant, reliable network is just critical. Can we shift gears though, because we're on limited time today? Let's talk about staking and how you see staking fitting into the overall DeFi ecosystem. I think that's an important topic. I always try to think of it as sort of the base layer of the cake, and that's my mental model. But would love to hear from you about that topic. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, there's a lot of different angles. What I'm not going to talk about is the benefit between, or the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. That's that'll take us somewhere else. I think what's interesting in general is that within these currency models, I think what proof of stake networks have done, they've educated people about really what it means to be a currency, because there's an interest bearing instrument baked into these networks by the simple act of committing your tokens into, let's say, a registered wallet, and so it kind of makes it makes the understanding of what crypto can do a lot more relevant, which is, hey, I can now own this token, and by definition, if I click a button and stake, for example, I just earn interest on it, right? So staking is kind of ultimately like opening your little bank account. You're like, oh, I stake. It means I have to commit my tokens to a wallet, my bank, ultimately for a particular period of time, and I automatically get interest that I earn. And so I thought what was interesting is it kind of opened the eyes, I think, to financial institutions of what a digital bond offering could look like. And it made it clear to them, oh, this is what this can do, and this is how we can monetize this, and this is why people like it. And so I think staking introduced a real sort of mind shift in the institutional landscape, where people really understood that, hey, there's some real yield earning opportunities here in an interesting, novel way, right? Where a lot of these communities are governed by really complex, nonlinear, open source communities. So they're secure in their own way, but they're also chaotic. So there comes risk with it. We talked about the network issue. And that's where staking to me is interesting, because you can commit to a node that's run by BlockDemon. There's lists of nodes in every network, and you can just click a button. And if you do it with us, we ensure it. We run failovers across multiple continents and data centers. And so we run very high performant backup systems to ensure that these networks always work, and you can simply earn interest. And so it opened, I think, the eyes of people who were kind of looking at crypto mostly through initially the payment angle of like, can you really use Bitcoin for payment? Nah, we're not so interested in that. I think smart contract models like Ethereum initially were also a little too complex, even though it's a super sexy model. I always think of Apple, and when I describe it, I'm like, hey, it's a little bit like your alarm setting. Imagine you have programmable money where you can say, hey, I give my kid $5 to buy this book in this store, and that's kind of, I can give you that money, and the money can only be spent in that context. And so there's great solutions there. But then staking is really where it's currently at, so there's between, let's say, 5 to 15% in computerized consistent earnings. What's fun is the consistency is offset by the chaos in the network. And so we try to bring that consistency to these networks, so institutional investors can secure that yield without risk. And that's really how I think about staking. So it's sort of similar to us, like kind of combines chaos with actual financial realism. And so that's sort of kind of where we come in as an entity as well.
Yeah, great. And then, so you talk about institutions. So two-part question. Can you just like break it down to the next level, how do you segment or cohort institutions? And then, what are these institutions asking you for or talking to you about, like above and beyond where we're at now?
Yeah, sure. And it's such a good question, because when I talk to people, initially I termed it enterprise, right? Like, so we're a SaaS company and we sell to enterprises. That's how I started. And people were sort of, I think, thinking about it. Like, the mistake I made is that people with enterprises thought about, oh, you mean Nestle or Procter & Gamble, and you're selling to those guys. So they immediately had that supply chain tomato example in their head. And that wasn't the cohort we were going after. For us, an institution initially was a crypto native institution, meaning, and I'm just giving them as an example, Coinbase, they run their own stuff, but is a good example that a lot of people know of a crypto native institution. They're really a large scale player with 40, 50 million customers, and they have institutional grade software requirements. And those are the entities that initially we were going after. We partner with a lot of them in Australia. B2C Market, for example, has been a customer of ours really since we started. Very innovative company, very advanced in thinking about network security settings. And so those were the sort of first generation of customers. Those are the institutions that are still representing the largest chunk of our revenue. Crypto native entities and institutions, ideally regulated, right? So regulated institutional entities, let's say with at least 1 million customers, is a good way to think about them. The next generation, and they're all pretty mature in their life cycle. Just to be clear, these guys normally run hundreds of protocols. They're fairly sophisticated in what they're doing, and so they're even though we do a lot of business, it's fairly commodified on that end. And we've done a lot of that commodification. And then the interesting part is taking what we've learned from those entities to the next generation, which are, let's say, the PayPals, companies like that, the ones that are in the last 12 months very vocal about allowing people to hold or acquire Bitcoin and Ethereum, for example. And so the PayPals, the Robinhoods, the eTors, the Voyagers, again, not riffing off customer lists, giving companies as examples that fall into that category of the next generation of crypto companies ultimately. And so a good example is, and again, it's not a customer reference, but Robinhood, for example, when you read there, who went public and had a difficult time. But if you read their S1s and also if you look at their public accounts, these digital equity financial institutions are really crypto companies now, because that's where they make the bulk of their money. There's just so much activity. There's just an overlap between 20 to 35-year-olds pushing their money into crypto, that it's a larger chunk of revenue than equity trading for a lot of those entities. And so these companies are becoming the next crypto native companies, but their needs are very different. They are kind of where the exchanges and custodians were 4 years ago when we started, which is like, hey, how do I actually run a proper Ethereum node? Which is, and so we're kind of sort of back to, and so the learnings we've made onboarding all these exchanges and custodians can now be automated and are a lot better and a lot more secure for that next generation of financial company. And then I think what's interesting, and then you have the Goldman Sachses and the JP Morgans and those guys who are now starting specifically to expose their customers to yield earning and trading experiences. And so that's also a really big cohort for us that we try to enable. And those are complicated conversations. There's a lot of security components here. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about outside of enabling staking, for example, and yield earning or high frequency trading opportunities or potentially even liquidity, we have to talk about security and regulatory compliance. And that was an important step for us as a company, as BlockDemon coming out of the crypto sphere, to make sure we're ISO compliant and we have insurance and we're a market leader in all those components. And so that's been a really important part of the conversation. And it's interesting that if you speak to those institutions, that's still the most important part of the conversation. And so, when we talk to our primary initial customers, the exchanges, the custodians, they're obviously a lot more gung-ho about regulation. I think the strategy for crypto native companies is, you do, and then you say sorry later. I think but then the sort of digital financial institutions already are a lot more regulated, have a lot more requirements, and suddenly you're back to where I come from, which is enterprise sales for software, right? Which is like, hey, what's your business disaster recovery strategy, and what are the the world you come from Amazon, like what are the different how do you handle redundancy and failovers in data centers and all that type of stuff that and that's a really important conversation that we look for and look forward to.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more on that as well. I think, we announced our insurance offering publicly last week. I got a ton of inbound on that. It was quite surprising how important people see this sort of, high-end institutional grade kind of requirements being built into crypto companies. And, how were you thinking about that, and any sort of feedback or anecdotes that have come back, probably, maybe specifically on the larger institutional side as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, we touched on it. I'm always so fascinated by the sort of bipolar nature of these networks, right? And so there's the sort of, the chaos is part of the recipe, right? So decentralized networks thrive and need to be run in a way where things can break and there's experimentation and there isn't a single entity dictating and running everything smoothly. And so you need service providers like us to cover those gaps for institutions, right? So it doesn't mean that we control the network. It means that we can offer institutional grade insurance products, for example, in order to bridge any potential losses and in case the network experience any significant downtimes, for example. And so it's and so that's what I find really interesting. I think actually over time, I think security in itself could be a currency, right? Like, and so you can, but ultimately it's a financial, if you think about it, it's a financial product in this context, right? So we're building reserves. We're able to lift up these networks very quickly. If they do go down, a good example is the Solana outage that occurred, I don't know, 6 weeks ago. We've publicly written a lot about it. It was actually BlockDemon engineers who really lifted that network back up relatively quickly in order to mitigate and minimize problems for the whole network. And so that's sort of the bridge we're the most excited about. And insurance really takes that uncertainty away from institutions because there's no guarantee that these networks will function. And no one can give you this guarantee because they're by definition nonlinear. And so, the insurance product has been really, really hard to get because insurance companies like, kind of some form of predictability. And so we had to spend a lot of time, and we have a lot of data points, and we've worked very hard in order to take the risk completely off the table for institutions. And so, which is really the only way legally institutions can engage in this type of crazy behavior, which is a lot of these currencies are still unclassified as securities or not. And so, for a financial institution to engage in that and then also have a potential risk of like, hey, I might lose customers' principal here, that's totally unacceptable. And so in my experience, if you can't take the risk off the table initially for these institutions completely, they will not engage. And so our job is to get these institutions onto these networks so we have more volume, we have more requirements for high failovers and security, so we can ensure that these networks scale appropriately. And so that's how we think about this. But it's a super cool insurance product. We were the first company to offer insurance. We used to just have a little bucket we put money in all the time and sort of kind of hope that if ever anything happened, that bucket would be able to cover it. And so it's kind of nice to actually have a real insurance and an insurance product that's unique in the market,
Yeah. And switching gears again, if you look into the broader DeFi market, is there one or two things that you see as really interesting or critical that needs to be built or is being built that's going to drive that next inflection point? Anything that comes top of mind there to you that, you're keeping an eye on or that you just think needs to be done? Yep.
Yeah, I think there's three things, and two of them we're pretty deeply involved with BlockDemon. So one is ultimately KYC and identity is still really, really tricky and important. Like, how do you KYC someone without them having to give up all their privacy, right? And so that's going to be really important. We just acquired a company called Gem that has a really interesting KYC passport product that carries across multiple different protocols that we're really excited about, because there's just no questions institutions can engage in this without proper KYC. But you have to structure KYC in a way where it doesn't kick out 95% of the potential users. And so there's a lot of workflow UX things that need to happen here, but that's a huge potential opportunity, I still think. And that's one of the reasons why we're very active in it. And we're active in it in the context of our liquid staking offering that we've just announced with Stakewise, where we want to offer lending capabilities for institutions to dip into in a pool where every token and every user is perfectly KYC'd and identified, so you can ultimately adhere to regulatory requirements. And so I think that's a super interesting area. So how to lend and provide liquidity, one. And so how do you do that? How do you structure that? And then how do you also KYC participants in it on an institutional level is super interesting to us. I think thirdly, what I'm always fascinated about is also a lot of the layer 2s and payment functionalities that are getting developed. And like Terra is a great ecosystem in Asia, for example, that has some fantastic systematic improvements in that area. It's based on Tendermint, ultimately the Cosmos ecosystem, that we find really interesting. There's a bunch of exciting projects, Osmosis, Juno, things like that solve a lot of liquidity and settlement issues in these networks. And so I'm always fascinated by how our crypto friends try to solve for these problems, and then really take that and how can we give that to an institution, right? And so that's really what I think the most about. And so it just never stops is kind of what's so fascinating. I kind of feel like it's just such a intriguing and multifaceted ecosystem, the cryptoverse, that every 3 months something launches and I'm like, oh my god, this is so amazing, I just want to do this now. And so as an entrepreneur, it's kind of, I'm lucky enough that BlockDemon has a wide enough remit to kind of be able to touch and play with a lot of these things. But yeah, there's always exciting stuff happening.
Yeah. And then, as you're looking forward then, so we've spoken about BlockDemon's building blocks, ecosystem for DeFi, as you look forward, maybe 12, 24 months on the horizon, like what are you hoping you see pop up? Like, or where do you think we might be, builders maybe building that, next protocol that we haven't seen yet? Like, have you had any thoughts around, that sort of question on?
Yeah, I think the next year we're going to see a lot of permission networks go live. I think we're going to have a second dawn of the permissioned world that we saw in 2018 when all the big guys were in there. I think, I think there's networks like even, the stuff Meta built or Facebook with Libra DM that's been open sourced and where, people are now launching permissioned networks on. So those networks specifically for institutions, just because they're easier to manage, also for financial institutions around settlements and trading networks. And so I think that's going to will get forked, for example. And so what existing code bases are going to get forked for very particular industrial use cases. And so I think a lot about that. What are the networks that are ultimately highly forkable? In an interesting way, and there's some really interesting chains that have been created in the past that I think are going to see fun iteration that you're going to hear more about. I also I'm really fascinated by payment still, even though I think we've seen a lot of evolution there. I think as BlockDemon on-ramp, off-ramp for fiat into crypto is still a horrible UX, where I think we want to offer a better infrastructure to help institutions to do that. And so converting fiat assets into crypto is something where I think the use case and the user flow can be vastly improved. And so that's an area we think a lot about. And Andrew, that better than anyone on the payment side with large companies in the space that we're talking to and thinking about. And what does node infrastructure mean there? And how do you settle payments across decentralized networks, and how do you think about that? And so I'm fascinated, as you said, at actually bringing it back to the world we come from, which is the telco world. I come from cell networks, and so I always go back to that, and I love to think of nodes as cell towers, right? And so I think a lot about what does that landscape of cell towers look like over the next 24 to 48 months, and so I'm intrigued to see what that looks like. We have ideas. Ultimately, we want to ensure that a lot of data can go through these towers, and we want to make sure we earn from the volume of data that goes through these towers. And so payment is one mechanism, yield is another, throughput could be the third one, for us. And so yeah, so.
Yeah. All right. And then most important question, when are we going to get you out to APAC? This calendar year?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I was trying to come, and then COVID always stopped me, and so I really was supposed to be in Japan a few times. We have, great partners there. Obviously, I want to see you in Singapore, where we just opened an entity and an office and are recruiting. And so the plan is, I think, in April, end of April, early May, I'm going to be in Singapore. So super excited to come over and spend some time with everyone. And I'd love to go to Australia. I was saying what is the German crocodile dandy?
I think now you've made the offer, there'll be multiple people messaging me to take you up on that. So I think we'll have to talk to Steve and the team on that as well. And
love to come there. Yeah, no, it'll be super great. Can't wait.
Yeah, great. Look, always great to chat, Konstantin. Thanks for your time, and thanks for sharing your thoughts on, the broader DeFi landscape and, how BlockDemon fits into it. And and then we'll hopefully get you out this way of the world sometime soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you, Andrew. And great to not meet anyone. But I hope I get to meet everyone in person soon. Thank you so much.
Great.